are back on the Zero Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We are living in an extraordinary moment in political and economic history. I can't imagine there was ever a July 4th like the one we just had. And here to talk about this moment in history and join us once again is Professor Richard Wolff. We always look forward to speaking with him. Richard Wolff is, of course, a professor of economics, the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, and in addition, the founder of democracyatwork.info. So without any further ado, let's get right to it. Richard Wolff, thanks once again for coming back on the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Always glad to have you. And the last time we were talking, the topic we were just touching on as we ran out of time was the movement in the streets that we're seeing, which, although it's not getting the coverage or perhaps the large crowds it was getting a couple weeks ago, there are still people out there. There are still atrocities taking place on the part of the police around the country, scattered but continue to occur. There continues to be a lot of discussion of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things we were just touching on in our last conversation was whether this movement in the streets was going to or was capable of or could or would bring clarity to this political moment in its economic contradictions, its political contradictions, as well as, of course, the racial issues and structural violence we face. It's a pretty broad topic, but before we get into specifics, do you have any general thoughts on that?
Sure. The things that well up in my mind are, first of all, a kind of gratitude that I feel towards the Black Lives Matter movement and towards other movements that have sprung up. There's an important one about evictions, movement of people who want moratoriums on evictions for the rest of the year, et cetera, et cetera. There's another one about people who cannot and do not want to be required to pay their rents for their apartments, and so on. And what makes me grateful is that there is movement, that there is activity, that people understand. It's a very big problem in America, that you can't get these things changed individually. And you can't really escape from them individually unless you have an awful lot of money, which most of us don't. And that therefore the really only solution is to get together and not be an individual anymore in terms of trying to change things, but to recognize that you need organization. It's a little bit like people who run a company, who understand that as an individual, very little is going to get done. But if you have a corporation with a hierarchy, with lots of people working in a coordinated way, it's amazing what you can get done. Labor unions understood you can't fight the boss all by yourself, and you can't escape from bosses all by yourself. But if you unionize, you join with other workers like yourself, the union can get things done which you as an individual can't. Well, all of that logic applies even more if the problem is a society that is not working, with a structure that is helping only the very few at the top. If you want to change that, doing it by yourself or imagining that you can privately escape are dead ends. And I think what the Black Lives Matter represents, as do the rent strikes and the anti-eviction movements, and others too, I'm just using them as example, these are signs that a growing number of people understand that movement of large numbers, organized, mobilized people is the way to go. And so for that, I am grateful and I am very hopeful. I think much more has to be done, not just more people drawn in, of course that, but also getting the unity. People come in for different reasons; those have to be respected, and they have to build a coalition, help each other. They don't have to agree on their own, each person with the other's priorities. This one can be focused on racism, that one can be focused on sexism, the next one can be focused on climate change, and so on. But it is important to come together to realize you can help each other within a framework of social change.
The way I would synthesize, I guess, what you're saying, Richard Wolff, is you could almost call it a meta politics of activism. You could to say, for example, that what we're seeing, in addition to the critical issues being addressed by each of these movements, is a politics of politics, a politics that says people are increasingly, even perhaps in many cases instinctively, coming to understand that in order to change the political situation, it's not a matter just of voting for two pre-established parties. It's not a matter of writing your member of Congress. It's those things have their own merits, but that really there's a new, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is there's a new kind of political awareness that understands that collective action organized by the people themselves is a vital, perhaps the most vital engine of transformation we have. Is that a fair kind of a restatement of what you're saying?
Absolutely. I would only expand on it by saying American individualism it has long been a very powerful counteracting ideology, which is it's an ideology that says somehow what happens in your life is entirely up to you and is all you're doing. The whole notion that there is such a thing as, quote unquote, the self-made man, this has to be countered. The United States is a real outlier in these kinds of thinking. I mean, I believe in individuality, but that's not instead of working together with other people. It's a respect for the things you need to do with others, together with the things you need to be free to do on your own. But it's not an either or, it is the combination. And in this country, the collective action has always been very frowned upon. We don't like it. The number of times I have encountered students who don't even know how to explain it, they just have an instinctual sense of not getting involved in an organization, a kind of fear that if they do, it will submerge them or deny them their individuality rather than enrich them with the potential of what their individual qualities and capabilities might become. Very sad to kind of watch. And movements like this suggest to me that more and more people looking at the problems of the world today are figuring out they have to get out into the street with other people to show that we care. They have to get out with other people to have the intimacies of interaction with other people and the sense of strength that comes from that, and the real strength to force the power at the top of the society to begin to have to worry that they better come to meet you halfway, or else you're going to be mobilizing still more people and they will not be able to strike as good a bargain with you later than they might get now, etc., etc.
What you're talking about, I think, is it used to be called solidarity, and it still is. It can be called comradeship, and I think a community. I think it is, at least in my experience, a positive feedback loop, something that's self-reinforcing, especially in person. And I know that's problematic right now with COVID-19, but when you get out in the street, when you get out in a meeting hall, whether it's a union hall or any place else, upstairs at a restaurant, wherever group of basement of a, religious, establishment, wherever a group gets together, when you come face to face with like-minded individuals, then you realize that the power of community is not just good for the community as a whole, but for yourself as an individual. You feel stronger, you feel nurtured, you feel less alone, you are more fully human. So if you don't agree with that, I mean, let me know, but I would assume you do.
Oh no, I do with enthusiasm, and I want to say not only thank you to the Black Lives Matter for making these kinds of events happen. I am struck by the number of relatively scattered small and medium communities across America, many of them with very, very small African American populations, coming out in record numbers, walking down the main street of their village or their town, carrying Black Lives Matter. Something in the George Floyd disaster touched them, and something in the Black Lives Matter movement touched them in a way that I think is deeper than has been the case before. There was something so symbolic in the use of the police to repress a human being this way that made everyone, at least for an instant, say, there but for the grace of God go I. What is going on here? And I also think that it shows that more and more white people are beginning to understand the most ancient claim of the opponents of racism, which is that race doesn't matter, that race is an artificial category, that we are not fundamentally different because of the amount of a pigment in our skin, that we really are equal, not because we declare it, but because it is the fact. And the anti-factual and the anti-natural is to draw a wall or a line, to imagine that if you have this particular quality, you are better than the next person. You deserve a better life. You deserve a better job. I think more and more white people, certainly those that I encounter, are beginning to understand that they are really and literally in the same boat. And so the assault by the police on that African American man in Minneapolis is viewed, consciously or not, by an enormous number of people as threatening them too. And it's not the particular police that is all the issue. It's more of a generalized sense that this system and the people who enforce the rules of this system are the problem. And we need to do something, and it can't be done individually. It's going to have to be done, however hesitant we are, as a group.
And Professor Richard Wolff, since both you and I are white men, and there is going to be, and since the power structure of this country is predominantly white, and the remnants of slavery, of course, are the remnants of white domination, this gets into the issue of the responsibility of the white majority at all class levels to respond to that particular crisis, the crisis of racism in American society. And one of the things that's been a subject of hot debate, primarily among, I would say, white leftists, is the question, for example, of the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I assume you may be familiar with it, but and Robin DiAngelo is a white corporate consultant on racism. She leads trainings on how white people can be less racist in the corporate setting. She has this book, White Fragility, that maintains that white people are fundamentally racist, and essentially that the way to address that is with a program of continuous individual education and self-improvement. Now, I've read most of White Fragility, and what strikes me about it and books like it is that they tend to assert that the white power structure's primary responsibility is to educate white working class people on what's wrong with them, as opposed to saying that we, as, for example, you and I, as white people who might be heard by members of the elite power structure, as opposed to saying, for example, that our responsibility is to tell them the best thing they can do to eradicate racism is to restructure capitalism, for example. So I guess what I'm getting at with that is I think within the multiple classes and pockets of power in the white community, I think there is, if not a conscious effort, then an unconscious effort to make sure that the vast and important debate opened up by Black Lives Matter does not threaten the privilege of the powerful. I've written about that in the context of Wall Street CEOs since the latest Black Lives Matter movement arose. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I always react badly to advice about overcoming your bad thinking in this area or that area. So, for example, asking masses of people to overcome their racism strikes me as bizarre and very unlikely to get you very far ahead. It should be the following in my mind. First, you ought to ask yourself, given that the United States has had this problem with African Americans, and let's just talk about since the Civil War, since we don't want to, for the moment, I'll talk about the slavery. The capitalism that dominates after 1865 inherits the slave mentality and the slavery that it has abolished, but it lasts. So the question that has to be asked is, given the Declaration of Independence, which said that all men are created equal, meaning all people, given that I believe the Christian doctrine that was dominant in the United States at the time says we are all equally God's children, et cetera, you really have to ask yourself, why was it the case that despite the religious commitment to the equality of all people and the official political commitment to the equality of all people, nothing remotely like the equality of all people was ever practiced, with particular reference to African Americans? And I think if you ask that question, you can't possibly end up with the answer, the white people weren't sensitive enough. Because even if you tried to give that answer, the immediate question would be, well, why weren't they? I mean, what's the problem here? Where does this all arise? And that's that point that I become a critic of capitalism, not because I don't like capitalism. It's true, I don't, but that's not the reason. The reason is, if you look at how capitalism works, you can answer the question why racism persists in the United States throughout its history, is institutionalized and made systemic, despite all of the efforts of all of the well-intentioned people, black and white, to do something about it. What is the ongoing reproduction of racism about? And let me give you the answer that makes me come to the conclusion about capitalism. Capitalism is a system. I've studied it all my life. Started in England in the 17th century, 18th century, spread to Europe, and then eventually took over the whole world, so that it's all capitalist. In that period of time, 300 plus years, here is one profound fact. On average, every 4 to 7 years, there's a crash. Suddenly, large numbers of people lose their jobs, not because they're not doing a good job, not because they don't want to work, and not because we don't need the output. All of those things remain true, but the system every 4 to 7 years breaks down. Businesses go out of business. Production is curtailed. Sometimes these crashes, or by the way, they have many words because they're so prevalent everywhere. Crash, bust, recession, depression, downturn, crisis. I could go on. These every 4 to 7 year events are traumatic. They deprive usually millions of people of work, of income, of self-esteem, of education if they're using the money from work to pay for school. I mean, the damage you do, the statistics are everywhere. Unemployed people who lose their job are much more likely to have problems with alcohol, with mental and physical diseases of all kinds, and on and on. They are the poor. They can never build up any savings because they are unemployed. Okay, so what's the problem? Here's the problem for capitalism. These periodic crashes, which are politely called in business schools business cycles, it's much less pejorative that way. These 4 to 7 year downturns would long ago have made capitalism unsustainable. You know why? Because the mass of working people would not have tolerated it. Every 4 to 7 years, you're at risk of losing your job, losing your income, and all the rest. Even if this time the crisis passes you by and hits your neighbor, you know, like your neighbor does, that 4 years from now or 6 years from now, it'll probably be your turn. If the crisis was distributed randomly across the society, the mass of workers would have said, I can't stand this. I have to have at least some minimal stability. I can't lose my job at risk every 4 years, or my home, or my children's education, or my ability to get some seniority to rise up in the company because I've been there long enough. I can't. It's not tolerable. So what did capitalism do faced with this existential problem? Well, it did try to get rid of business cycles. It has been trying that for the 300 years. That is a complete failure. That's why we're in one now. And in case you're wondering, let me remind everybody, since this new century started, the year 2000, we had the dot-com crisis in 2000 March, we had the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and we have the COVID-19 crisis in 2020. 20 years, 3 crises, you got it, an average of somewhere between 6 and 7, just like always. So how did capitalism survive when the mass of people could not and would not have tolerated being subjected to a system so relentlessly unstable? Answer: find a subgroup in the population and put the whole burden of instability on them. If you could do that, you could then go to the majority of the working class and say, you don't have to worry. We can't do anything to stop the crises, but we will immunize you. We will keep you from having to be unstable. Don't you worry. There will always be someone who is fired before you are. Who are the people who are last hired and first fired? Always first fired. African Americans across American history. That's why they cannot amass wealth. The wealth of the African American community is 1/10 today of what it is for whites on average. Not even close. Last hired, first fired, discriminated against. So they can't accumulate any savings to get their own home, which they often don't have. They can't accumulate a good credit score. They can't accumulate the seniority at the job to move up in the system. They are the folks at the bottom. But that's not because we are insensitive, we white people. What we are is grateful, whether we admit it or not, that someone else has to live with the recurring burden of capitalism's instability, that we are exempted from that obligation. And therefore, I tell you and I tell everybody who asks, capitalism is the problem. It solved its peculiar instability by sacrificing the African American community. And by the way, it doesn't have to be African Americans. It could just as well be Latino people. In European countries, immigrants play this role. In France, when the economy is booming, you bring North Africans into the country across the Mediterranean. And when the economy turns down, you push them back into Algeria, into Libya, into Morocco, into Tunisia, and so on. The Germans did that with the Turks. You know, the Italians did it with the Greeks, and so on and so on. It's always horrible. It makes one community the victim of a system and makes the other community exempt. And then you have the fruitful opportunity for the genuine racists, the people who hate, but also the people who run the system. Because it's very good to explain to white people that the reason those black folks over there live in those parts of town, drive those cars, have those problems, is because they're black, not because capitalism cannot live without putting, somebody into that particular role. And I don't think we'll get rid of racism with sensitivity training. I'm not against sensitivity training. We need it. But we've got to do something about the basic economic structural reality that keeps reproducing the division of our society and the comforting notion to white people, not that this is a system that really hurts, but shut up, it won't hurt you. Let the hurt be over there with our black brothers and sisters. White people don't want to think like that, but that's the reality of the economic system. Wouldn't it be better, my conclusion, to change the economic system, to get away from a system that's so unstable, so that we don't have to put any group of people, white, black, brown, yellow, men, women, old, young, and societies, immigrant, native, capitalist societies have used all different groups to play this horrible role. I call it being the shock absorber of the instability of capitalism. Better solution, change the system so that not only African Americans, but nobody is subjected to that kind of recurring trauma every 4 to 7 years.
Well, you know, when you were speaking, Richard Wolff, I was reminded of all things, the 2008 controversy in the primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, where one of Hillary Clinton's proxies, surrogates, Geraldine Ferraro, said of Barack Obama, "It's not his turn." And it created a stir, fortunately, and pushback, fortunately. I think, and I thought at the time, I wrote at the time, that Geraldine Ferraro, as a product of the white working class, as I was, knew exactly what she was doing, that she didn't mean it's Hillary Clinton's turn because she's been around so long, or it's a woman's turn. This to me was standard rhetoric used against black people by lower income working white people. In my experience, you know, these people, RJ Eskow, they want to come and take my Sammy's job down at the plant, and I'm not going to let them. You know, in other words, instead of thinking about why isn't your Sammy paid more down at the plant, why is your Sammy afraid of getting laid off, it diverts it to, you have an enemy now. You have somebody you can condemn, and you're not thinking about, hey, the corporation that owns this plant made billions of dollars last year, and I haven't had a decent raise in 10 years, and they're talking about moving it overseas. It seems to me that's the old dodge playing out over and over again, and maybe that's exactly what you're talking about.
You know, I agree with you, but I think that the strategy for the left in that situation would be to give the Geraldine Ferraro type their due. They have a wisdom in all of that. together mixed in with their racism, there is a wisdom. They are deeply suspicious that if the black community, the African American community, gets itself together, mobilizes, and puts pressure, the way capitalism works, they will give oil to the squeaky wheel. If the blacks make it impossible to go forward, then the capitalists will give to the blacks and take away from the whites. And that, in fact, has happened over and over again in American history. There were long periods of time in the 20th century when every time a white working class in a factory somewhere went on strike, standard procedure of the employers, also white, would be to bring in African American workers who were desperate for work, and then to see and watch the tension between them until they could determine who is the one we're going to keep working here, who's the one we're going to give the job to. And the whites had better connections in the rest of the community, could pull in more political support, et cetera, et cetera. So they usually won. And I think the left has to understand you have to demand the equality that African Americans need, want, and deserve. But you've got to do it in such a way that it's crystal clear that your movement, you as a white person, or I as a white person, we will not permit what we're asking for African Americans to be taken out of the skins and the bodies and the bank accounts of white working people. That's why the system critique is so crucial, not just because it's the correct analysis, which I think it is, but because it can become the glue for a coalition between the demands of an African American community way overdue to be granted and the fears of a white community that somehow it will be at their expense. A left which could say, no, 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 that's not who we are, would in that way blunt the racists and the right wing, which is appealing to the same white working class and insisting that any advance for black people is a threat against them. When Donald Trump says that Black Lives Matter is a hate group, that's what he's doing. He is trying to appeal to white working class people that these African Americans demanding what white people want too is a threat to those white people, is a hateful attack, so that they should rally behind Trump, who will protect them from the African American demand. The left has to see that and respond in kind. And that requires making the enemy the system, which I also think is analytically spot on.
So I don't know what your schedule is or if you need to go, but that brings to...
Let's do another 10 minutes, Richard.
Okay, good. Because that brings to mind another, to me, very important issue, because I think that's spot on. But there is an increasing effort, I would say, it seems to me, perhaps a deliberate effort, although I don't know, but an increasing effort to drive a wedge between the concept of class and the concept of identity, and to argue that those of us who think we must address class issues in our public lives, in our society, are somehow disregarding the role of race and racism in our history and in our current lives, and that therefore the only way to ensure identity justice, whether it be for based on gender, based on race, based on faith, based on immigration status, what have you, is to ensure there's no discussion of class. Now, it's often presented as the other way around, that somehow people who discuss class justice or economic justice are enemies of the racial project. But when I look back, for example, at the history of socialism and communism in the United States, frankly, the Communist Party has an a long record dating to the early 20th century, at least, of being among the first to address issues of race, among the first to call for integration, among the first in the 1930s to float ideas that are still considered too radical today, like should Black Americans be given their own state, homeland in the South. I mean, there have been a broad variety of radical explorations of race on the Americans, economic or class left. And yet today we're being somehow told that by some that there's a tension between the two. Now, maybe there's somebody I haven't heard of who argues from a class or socialist point of view that we shouldn't care about race, but I've always seen the two as closely fused. I've always experienced people on the left economic left as recognizing them as totally fused. So I don't get this stoking of a tension between class and identity, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think what we have is a need to understand what social movements for social change always are. And they always are coalitions. The leaders and the enthusiasts can pretend we're all agreed, but we aren't. Are we still connected?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. We aren't. All movements are coalitions. So, for example, any movement to change the United States will be a coalition of, among others, people whose priority is to change classes and people whose priority is to change the racial discrimination, the racial inequality. And that's fine. You have your priorities, I have mine. They come out of our personal histories, the way we were raised, the experiences we've had. The only question is, can we forge an effective coalition based on a simple proposition? I will help you achieve the social changes you want, and in exchange, you will help me get the changes I want. We don't have the same priority. One of them is more important for you, the other one is more important for me. But more important is not exclusive. Because it's more important, I am willing, because I believe in what you're struggling for, and I also need your help. Put it right out on the table. This is an understanding most human beings have. That's how you build it. If, on the other hand, I want to destroy a social movement, what I try to do, consciously or otherwise, is figure out what the coalition is they've got going, and then do my damnedest to persuade the people that they can't trust one another, that each of them is putting their own interest ahead of the collective coalition interest. I want to break it up. So it became very clear, even before it became public, that the efforts of the FBI, the CIA, and so on in the 1960s, when there was so much movement, SDS, anti-racism, and all the rest, it was very important to get people to argue with each other. What's the primary objective? What's the primary contradiction? What should we all be working on? Instead of understanding how do we build an effective coalition among people with different priorities. So you're right. I'm not surprised. There have always been people trying to break coalitions on the left by setting the different components, the groups that coalesce, or at least could coalesce, by getting them to turn against each other in mistrust, in arguments over what's the most important issue, when the whole purpose is not to have that dead-end conversation, but to figure out how we can help you and you can help us to produce a world that neither has the class structure nor the racial discrimination that we both want to see disappear. I think that's the basic issue. It's very practical. It's very much about struggle, and not some abstract conversation about what comes first, discrimination against racial groups or gender groups or age groups or religious groups or ethnic group. I mean, it never stops. It's a dead end, above all, for effective politics.
Well, I can't really, say much more than that, except to point out that Martin Luther King, who was a democratic socialist, had the Poor People's Campaign at the end of his life. That was his vision, being carried on now by William Barber. Malcolm X said the ultimate enemy was capitalism. I mean, so I think a lot of wise people who are identified with fighting racism understood this interconnectivity you're talking about. And I guess my closing thought would be, I saw a corporate CEO wearing an I Can't Breathe t-shirt. And my thought was, a black child is 7 to 10 times more likely to die of asthma than a white child. So if that CEO is not working to change the system that creates that reality, I wonder how deep their commitment to this issue is. But that's my closing thought. If you have one, I'd love to hear it.
No, I think that I understand what you're saying. I agree with it. I am heartened, and this goes back to the first issue you posed. I am heartened by the huge number of white people that are initiating as well as following African American leadership in the Black Lives Matter. I think the polls confirm that people under 40 in this country are less corrupted by racism than any generation in our history. This is the same age group that votes overwhelmingly for Bernie Sanders when confronted with Sanders versus Biden. I see things emerging and coming together that make me quite hopeful.
Well, on that optimistic note, very much appreciated in these times and always. Richard Wolff, economist, host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, Tuesday evenings, I believe, if I remember correctly. Yes. As always, great talking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Richard. And I look forward to when we resume.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.